So let's move to our discussion and start to dig into these findings. There will be time for questions and from the audience, and I ask you to, as you go along, to put your questions in the Q&A, and we will come to them as we go along or reserve time at the end. And this will be recorded, and you can access the recording later on the site of the Australian Human Rights Institute. So Freya, let's start with you. Can you begin by explaining a little bit, what the report was focused on? What was its aim, and a snapshot of these key findings?
Thanks, Justine. And I'm just going to share my screen just for this first question so that we can give a little bit of the background by using our slides. So hopefully that's showing up for everybody. So our main aim with this report was to really look at the first round of company reporting under the Modern Slavery Act to understand what was that telling us about the Act's effectiveness in terms of driving changes to corporate practices. And as Justine mentioned just before, the aim of the Act when it was initially enacted was to drive this race to the top by businesses to promote taking proactive and effective actions to mitigate modern slavery risks in their operations and supply chains. So rather than looking at, the biggest companies or the, top 100 or 200 listed companies, we chose to really hone in on 102 companies that were sourcing high risk goods from specific sectors with known modern slavery risks. And in particular, we looked at companies sourcing garments from China, rubber gloves or PPE from Malaysia, horticulture from Australia, and seafood from Thailand. And our intention was trying to get behind the statements and to see how companies were reporting against the mandatory criteria, but beyond that, to see, are they disclosing some of the key risks in their supply chains, and what actions are they taking to address those risks, and are those actions effective? So those were the sort of three areas that we studied as we undertook the statement review. And we measured it against 66 indicators, which when we go back into the methodology a little bit for this report, we'll talk about in more detail, focusing on high-risk sectors and a set of over 100 companies. What we found was that in terms of compliance with the mandatory reporting criteria, 77% of the companies we reviewed failed to report against all mandatory criteria that are set out in the Act. And in terms of risk identification, over half, 52%, failed to note these key modern slavery risks in their supply chains and in their statements. In terms of action, only about 27% could show that they were taking some form of effective action to mitigate against those risks. So as a snapshot, what these findings show is that many of the companies are missing the mark when it comes to putting reports in to the Act, not just in relation to addressing what the Act has required companies to report upon, but also on a deeper level in terms of engaging with risks and disclosing evidence of effective action.
So we're going to dig down into those findings in a moment, but Amy, can you take us through a little bit about, there was an extensive review process involved in this research. Can you explain how the statements were selected for review and how the assessment indicators were developed and tested?
Yeah, thanks, Justine. I know there's been quite a bit of interest in the methodology that we use, so I'll just take a few minutes to run through this. So as Freya just mentioned, the primary focus of this research was a review of modern slavery statements from selected companies in the first reporting period to enable us to evaluate the early impacts of the Modern Slavery Act. And in terms of how we selected the companies whose statements we reviewed, we were reviewing statements published on the government's Modern Slavery Act register. Of these, we reviewed 102 statements from companies known to be operating in or sourcing from 4 high-risk sectors that are linked to specific geographic locations. And these locations and sectors were seafood from Thailand, which is 25 companies, horticulture and viticulture in Australia, again, 30 companies, and the 4th sector was PPE gloves sourced in, used in the healthcare sector and sourced in Malaysia. And again, that was around 25 companies. So how did we know if a company operates in a specific sector or not? Well, in many cases, this was evident on the face of the company's modern slavery statement or from information on its website. And where this wasn't the case, we wrote to the company in question to confirm sourcing details. Within the 4 sectors that we looked at, individual companies were selected based on specific selection criteria. Firstly, we were looking at for-profit commercial entities of differing sizes. We also selected entities that are operating at a range of points in the supply chain, so producers, importers, distributors, and retailers as well. And our focus in this research was on mandatory rather than on voluntary reporters. And finally, we looked at both Australian entities and international entities as well. And you can find the complete list of all of the companies whose statements we assessed in the report. In terms of how we developed the indicators and tested those, as you've heard, our aim with this research was to examine not only strict legal compliance with the Modern Slavery Act mandatory reporting criteria, but also to be looking at risk awareness amongst companies and the substance of the actions they're taking. So in order to do this, we developed 66 indicators in total. 11 of these were looking to measure specifically compliance with the mandatory criteria in section 16(1)(a) to F of the Act, and the additional indicators relate to assessing risk disclosures and evidence of meaningful actions. The indicators were developed in consultation with project partners, and they were tested in an extensive pilot assessment. And the content of the indicators aligns closely with the reporting requirements of the Act, as well as the government's guidance for reporting entities, which itself is informed by the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And they're also aligned with the government's modern slavery COVID-19 guidance. The content was also informed by our respective organisational expertise. So this includes the corporate human rights disclosure methodologies applied in approaches such as the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre's FTSE 100 UK Modern Slavery Act methodology, Know the Chain benchmark, and also the corporate human rights benchmark. Our analysis of the statements followed a staged process, a staged assessment and then validation process. And each of the statements was assessed by 2 trained assessors who were applying a guide and a scoring document as they went through. And the 2 assessors' results were then validated by a 3rd reviewer who verified the scoring. And then, as a final point, it's worth also noting that we conducted background desktop research as well on the sectoral risks, the relevant sectoral risks, and entity-related modern slavery risks that are in the public domain. And Freya can tell you a bit more about this later on. But basically, the statements were assessed in light of the results of this research to see how well companies are describing obvious sectoral risks that they are encountering, and as well as how they're dealing with specific public allegations of labour rights abuses that have been made against them. Thanks.
Thanks, Amy. And we're going to go into some of the sectoral specific risks as we go along. But Ramila, I want to turn to you because one of the key sectors focused on the report is the garment sector and modern slavery risks associated with sourcing in China. So the report finds that of the 30 statements reviewed, 3 in 4 companies didn't actually identify this as a risk in their statements. Can you tell us a little bit about what's happening to Uyghur communities in East Turkestan, or Xinjiang as it's known, and what risks Australian companies actually should be aware of associated with the garment sector in China?
Sure, thank you, Justine. Uyghurs have been facing oppression and occupation by the Chinese Communist Party for decades. However, since late 2016, egregious human rights abuses are being committed, which have amounted to genocide. And over 7 democracies have determined this fact. Unfortunately, not Australia. Credible evidence of 380 concentration-style camps have been built to hold Uyghurs and Turkic people of East Turkestan. And many of these camps have got factories attached to them, where these innocent people are being used in these companies to make the garments that we wear. And this is not the only sector, unfortunately. They are used in various sectors across. We have lost our loved ones to prison sentences on trumped up charges. lost communication with our family members and friends, and know that they are in various re-education or labor camps across East Turkestan, and some are also in mainland China. We also have credible evidence, as most of you know, that Uyghurs for sale and movements of Uyghurs and Turkic people of East Turkestan to mainland China to work in these factories. These people do not go by choice, they are forced, and or their families and future is compromised if they refuse. They are held in extremely harsh conditions, working very long hours for very little pay. That's if they do get paid at all. They are segregated, their movements and their communication are monitored, and they are also politically indoctrinated in these labor camps. Our concern is Australian companies are unknowingly complicit in China's genocide, and slave labor and mass people movement is one of the biggest components of China's plan to eradicate my people. And no Australian company, industry, or the government should be complicit in the current genocide.
Thanks, Ramila. I mean, what you're saying there also is that it's not confined to this region, that the risks are much broader than that, particularly through the movement, the forced movement of people outside of that region to work in factories. This report is particularly highlighting the garment sector in China, but one of the other sectors that's been in the news a lot most recently is particularly the production of solar panels too, from around that region. Yes. Freya, this report, let's go into this sectoral risk a little bit more, because it talks about these 4 high-risk sectors. And I know you spoke to a few affected workers in these sectors. What were some of the themes that were coming to light from speaking with people with first-hand knowledge of modern slavery risks?
Thanks, Justine. So when we're talking about modern slavery, what we're sort of getting to the heart of is people being forced to work against their will, working because they have no choice, because they can't escape the conditions in which they're labouring, day after day, year on year. Some of the themes that came out when we did speak to people who are affected or their representatives was this repeated theme of people being unable to escape and working even when clearly the answer was no, as well as the fact that migrant workers in particular, which feature in 3 out of the 4 sectors we reviewed, because of the vulnerabilities and the lack of security in their visa status, have also faced extensive exploitation that has translated in severe cases to instances of modern slavery. So one of the glove workers that we spoke to, for example, talked to us about how workers, in the context of the COVID pandemic, where there's been so much additional pressure placed on glove workers to meet heightened targets to satisfy the global demand for PPE, workers who are unwell would be hiding away in these crowded dormitories, trying to rest and be sort of taken out by supervisors who would hunt them down to force them into completing 12, 13, 14-hour shifts, even when they were feeling unwell. And that being able to see a doctor, there was no guarantee of that. If you were lucky enough to see a doctor, you then had to return back to the factory to finish off your 12-hour shift. We heard that people were working 6 days a week, if not 7 days a week, around the clock for less than $2 an hour, which is less than half of a living wage in Malaysia. In respect of some of the other sectors, for example, horticulture here in Australia or seafood in Thailand, a theme around that migrant worker exploitation was really the use of deceptive recruiters, and the fact that recruiters can really perform this interface between the employer at the far end and the worker, such that people can't complain because they're threatened that they'll be sent back to their home countries, they'll be reported to the authorities if they don't work and if they don't accept the conditions in which they're presented. So many are severely underpaid, particularly if they're being paid piece rates, and it can be very, very little, far less than the minimum wage. And there's an inability of workers to leave because of the precarity of their situation and because there's nowhere else to go. And so people just have to work.
Yeah, and we'll come into, again, sort of some of these known risks and why you think it is that companies are not reporting them so well. But Amy, there was a deliberate, sort of move with our report to call it paper promises. And the stat that Freya highlighted at the start was that 77% of companies are failing to meet mandatory criteria reporting, which seems quite startling. So what is it that companies are doing well in terms of meeting reporting, and where are they failing? Why is this so high?
Yes, that's right, Justine. So what we found was over 3/4 of the companies that we looked at were assessed not to be providing information in their statements in compliance with the mandatory reporting requirements. Areas where company disclosures and statements were the strongest include, firstly, where companies were describing their own operations and activities as opposed to describing their supply chain. So that would relate to section 16.1 part B. Secondly, when looking at modern slavery risks, companies can be seen to be doing better in terms of describing their potential to be linked to modern slavery through their supply chains, rather than in their own business where they tend to perform weaker. And this reflects, I think, a general misconception that out there that modern slavery is largely an offshore overseas issue, and demonstrates that there is a lack of focus on how companies' own practices and own business models might be causing or contributing to modern slavery in the supply chain, for example, through unreasonable purchasing practices. We found that a few companies connect the generalized sort of descriptions of modern slavery risks that we're seeing in statements with their own products or services. So they might talk about modern slavery, but in very general terms, and haven't sort of thought through exactly how their products and services are connected with it. Another area that we looked at that scored more highly is evidence of continuous improvement in company statements. So specifically, we were looking at how companies were describing plans for the future and steps that they would be initiating to respond to modern slavery. So it'll be interesting to see the extent to which these plans are rolled out and that we find information on these steps provided in future statements. In terms of where companies are performing more weakly, our assessment sort of showed that there are 4 top areas where companies are falling down. So firstly, we found that supply chain knowledge was very weak. This is obviously a really critical first step in conducting human rights due diligence, but our assessment showed that there was really little knowledge about suppliers beyond tier 1 of the supply chain, and information about workforce composition in companies' supply chains was also really lacking. Secondly, in terms of risk awareness and the disclosure in statements was weak. And it's interesting to note here that of the statements we looked at, only 8% of those actually mentioned actual instances of modern slavery and how the company in question had responded to those. And then the 4th area, the sort of weakest area, would be lack of effective actions, particularly in several key areas that are, of greater significance for supply chain workers. And I know that we'll be coming back to this later on, so I'll leave that there. Thanks.
Thanks, Amy. So one of the things that you're highlighting is particularly around a lack of knowledge around supply chain, and that then led to the next stat, which you said that only 8% of companies are actually identifying any modern slavery in their supply chain, which isn't consistent with some of the global figures around the preponderance of modern slavery. So Freya, can you take us a little bit through, how well companies are identifying these sector-specific risks and what they're talking about in terms of mitigating them? And then Ramila, we'll come to you to talk a little bit about, your response to these efforts by companies.
As Amy mentioned, I think we found 4 out of 5 companies, about 79%, were ticking the box in terms of describing supply chain risks. But when we looked through the sectoral lens at where the companies were actually disclosing the risks that were associated with sectors they were supplying from, it was far fewer. Only 52% had failed to identify those risks. And sector by sector, we've already mentioned 3 out of 4 garment companies didn't mention the risk of the use of Uyghur forced labour in their Chinese garment supply chains, which, despite the amount of information that's out there and the fact that everyone's talking about what's happening there, was a real surprise, I think. We also found 52% of healthcare companies sourcing rubber gloves from Malaysia failed to disclose that risk. And interestingly, this year, despite guidance that companies should be reporting on how the COVID-19 pandemic had increased their modern slavery risks. 3/4 of the companies we reviewed in that sector didn't mention at all the impacts of COVID on modern slavery risks in the glove sector. 52% of companies sourcing fresh produce from Australia also failed to note those risks, and 2 out of 5 companies in the seafood sector didn't disclose seafood as a high-risk area either. What we found kind of across the board was that a more commonly identified risk was the use of temporary migrant workers or migrant workers. It was included in several statements that we reviewed, but there was less engagement with some of the more root causes of what underlies some of these risks of modern slavery. For example, risks around the lack of unionisation or lack of union coverage of a workforce. There was only 6% of companies that mentioned that, despite that being kind of quite common among a number of the sectors that we looked at. So overall, we found that the analysis of risks was fairly superficial in many ways, with companies choosing to focus much more on what they were doing in terms of addressing risk than really getting into what risks were present in their operations and supply chains.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a couple of things there. One is that a lot of the time when we read the statements, there's this general, it's a risk if there's migrant workers involved in your supply chain. So the odds of having migrant workers in your supply chain is very high. And what companies were failing to do were actually relate that question to their own circumstances a lot of the time. I think it's what we all find, at university when we're marking student papers, the student answer the question they want to, but they don't necessarily answer the questions we've asked. And so there was a very general nature around the risk. And was also, were you surprised around the figure around the sort of lack of awareness around forced labour risks in Australia's backyard in relation to produce? Because you said, I think it was only 52% identified that as a risk. Why do you think that is?
That was a surprise, I think, and I should say some companies have done really well in their risk analysis, and some companies identified every risk that we would have identified for a given sector. But in terms of Australia, what we noticed kind of across the board was a lack of understanding that things that happen in Australia can relate to modern slavery, and this conception that modern slavery is something that happens far away in global supply chains, nowhere near where we are. We often saw in statements this reference to the idea that because we're operated by Australian law and Australian law is strong, there's very minimal risks in our operations. And we saw that time and time again. And I think that definitely kind of played a part in companies not kind of going beyond that safety and security that they have of knowing the market in which they're operating in and looking to, the many inquiries and investigations about very exploitative practices in the horticulture sector and how rampant some of those abuses are.
So Ramila, listening to this, sort of the report where it's finding that many companies were failing to disclose the risk, particularly the garments from China around Uyghur forced labour. Does this surprise you? And we know that there's many difficulties in actually accessing data around this, that access to factories in the Xinjiang region is largely blocked for most companies. And so most companies might be relying on the word of their supplier. Or a survey from their supplier. We know that in other parts of China, factories are being audited, but there are many, many limitations with how those audits are being carried out. So I guess the question is to you is, do you find it surprising that there's not a greater awareness at a general level about this? And is there advice about how companies can think about this, given the difficulties in accessing specific data around perhaps their suppliers?
We know that China is a whole new ballgame, as you said, about the information and lack of access to these companies. But the findings were an eye-opener for us. And I think the disappointment for us Australian Uyghurs is the enforcement or the lack of enforcement of penalties that are applied by the governing bodies. The average person will believe that there is a strong policy and governance and legislation in place and held to account. But it seems that these companies are using excuses of not being able to have access. Well, there are other methods that we can take, an action, governments can take action, industries can take action to stop these industries from using forced labor, Uyghur forced labor, which is amounted to genocide. And to these companies, if they're just ticking boxes, and that was mentioned earlier, that where's human lives? Where's people's lives here? Are we only secondary to profit? I mean, it's not impossible to hold these supply chains to account. It's not impossible. We've seen other countries do it, stopping these produce from coming in at the border and having stronger legislations in place. And Australia not acting on this legislation and not following suit from other democracies is really, really sad. And you know, it feels like these industries have failed. Over 40 million slave labor across the world. It feels like these industries have failed. Humans have failed us, and in my case, failed the Uyghurs and the Australian consumers.
Yeah, and you talk about other actions around it, and we've seen other countries, as you've said, make statements around, you know, calling what's going on in the region genocide. The US and Canada is also, or US initially has imposed some import bans in relation to these products. Australia has a forced labour bill sitting in Parliament that has not been passed, which might be something that could supplement this type of law as well. And there's lots of questions coming in, so I'm going to go to them just after this one more question to Freya and Amy. And I just want to talk a little bit about the really hard part of the reporting, which is around defining effectiveness and how this was judged, and you know what the compliance rate around this one was a little bit. Amy, can you start talk a little bit about sort of the mandatory compliance range? What did you look at around effectiveness? How, you know, what is effectiveness to you?
Yeah, thanks. So as you've heard, we had a layered approach to our assessment here, and so we looked at what the first layer that we looked at was compliance with the mandatory criteria of the law, but then beyond that we looked at salient risks and how well they're being addressed. But for the purposes of the first layer, so measuring mandatory compliance, we were really looking for evidence that a reporting entity has KPIs or some form of metrics in place in order to be able to measure the effectiveness of its own efforts, and can provide reasonable information in its statement to describe what those metrics would look like. So, for example, relevant KPIs might relate to trainings or awareness programs that the entity was running on modern slavery, complaints that had come in and that it had handled about modern slavery, or how it goes about engaging with suppliers and building the capacity of its suppliers, and so on. You'll see from the report that the compliance rate with this particular criteria was 53%. So only half of the companies that we looked at can show that they have metrics to measure their performance on this issue of modern slavery. And why is this important? Well, because companies really need to be capturing information about their responses and about their efforts so that the impacts of their actions can be tracked and they can be refined over time to ensure that the steps that companies are taking, and we are seeing companies taking steps, but to ensure that those steps are of substance and rather than cosmetic in nature.
And I do urge you to go into the report where there's a lot more detail around effectiveness, and there's best practice examples of what we consider works and what doesn't work. So we're giving you a high level view here. But Freya, do you want to add to that a little bit and talk about you know, what you were looking at when you were reviewing statements and what distinguishes perhaps action from effective action?
Sure. So what we found was that a lot of companies are sort of ticking the box in terms of some of the steps that are the essential precursors to taking effective action on modern slavery. And so we were looking at matters such as, do companies have specific policies in place? Are they undertaking training with suppliers? Do they have contractual clauses that govern how suppliers should respond to modern slavery laws, and that you know have a company's expectations clearly set out? But beyond that, we wanted to see whether this action was actually effective or whether it was sort of a paper-driven response to modern slavery that didn't have a life off the page as that. So some of the indicators that we looked at were how are policies being communicated to suppliers? Are there any capacity building in strategies or engagements happening down the supply chain, the extent and nature of supplier monitoring, the extent of consultation with migrant worker groups, unions, civil society organisations, and how that's actually feeding into the company's modern slavery strategy, as well as how sectoral risks were being addressed more specifically. For example, do companies have recruitment controls? How are they ensuring that no one pays for a job? Those sorts of metrics. And we found that on these sort of more what we've described as effective actions, companies tended to really underperform. So only 1 in 4 companies could show that they were undertaking a form of human rights due diligence on new suppliers in the selection phase. 1 in 5 were disclosing evidence of responsible purchasing practices. And we found that by and large, companies in the garment sector tended to outperform others on measures such as responsible purchasing practices and also disclosure of suppliers and providing greater information about their supply chain. 14% of companies disclosed commitments to paying a living wage among their supply chain, with 2% actually having a time-bound plan and factoring that into their pricing indices. I think one of the interesting ones we found was while 57% of companies stated support for freedom of association, only 12% could demonstrate evidence that there was freedom of association among their workforce. As I mentioned earlier, we found that there was a group of companies, about 8%, who are really leading in terms of demonstrating key actions and really striving to mitigate their risks. However, we found on balance that many companies were really at the starting blocks when it came to engaging in actions that were effective.
So that leads into a question we have from Darren, who, and Amy, I'll put it to you, who asks, as this is a review of the first round of statements, understanding that companies would be on a steep learning curve, to what extent do you attribute non-compliance with the Act to be a direct consequence of, say, first-time reporting? And another question that's been asked by someone else is sort of, can we see any comparisons between where Australia is now versus where the UK statements, have they progressed over time and led to far greater improvement? So, is it just a first year blip? And because Australia is only now going into the second year, is there any evidence from overseas that things are improving?
Thanks for that. Yes, I think that's an interesting question, and obviously it's early days here. We in this research we're looking at the initial impacts only of the Act, but there are precedents from overseas. The UK Modern Slavery Act has been in place since 2015, and many of the companies that we're looking at in Australia are reporters and have been reported under the UK Act. So there is precedent out there on company reporting on modern slavery. The work that the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre has done in the UK to assess responses to modern slavery is revealed by the statements under the UK Act since 2015 have really shown that over the period since the UK Act has come in, it can't be seen to have had a dramatic effect on improvements in company action. It's definitely had the result of raising awareness around modern slavery, and as a result, human rights issues more broadly. The fact that, as with the Australian Act, statements need to be signed off by the Board of Directors is really key in terms of elevating human rights issues within company agendas. But overall, since the UK Act has come in, there has been little discernible change in those key areas that can be seen to sort of be more fundamental. So questions around, how do business models themselves drive exploitation in supply chains, the extent to which key steps like supporting freedom of association by companies are being supported. So I would say that it's early days here. It's the first round of assessments, but there is evidence to suggest that reporting regimes like this in and of themselves are unlikely to be enough.
And we should say that an independent review of the UK Act done in the last few years indicated that there was a need to strengthen their law and particularly look at a form of sort of carrot and stick, but some sanctions around non-compliance around reporting, and potentially looking also at the role of directors in fueling a better not only response rate, but also quality of reporting. Which, Freya, brings me to one of the questions that were asked around sort of where do we go from here? One of the questions that was asked by Claire is that, do we need better due diligence compliance requirements, and how might that actually be instituted if that might strengthen responses?
One of our key recommendations to business as well as government is around the idea of due diligence and incentivising companies to undertake sort of thorough human rights due diligence in order to identify and assess their modern slavery risks and take action to mitigate against those. And so what we've seen so far is that a focus on reporting without more isn't necessarily leading to the action that we need to see in order to transform company practices and really get action in this area. So one of our recommendations is to introduce into the Modern Slavery Act a duty to prevent modern slavery, which would require companies to identify and assess their salient modern slavery risks and take action to address them. And it would be a defence to liability where a company can demonstrate that it's undertaken appropriate and reasonable due diligence to mitigate against its risks. We've also recommended a suite of other reforms in the report in more detail, including featuring enhanced patents to businesses and a potential import ban on goods provided with forced labour. But we think that due diligence is an important part of how we can make this act stronger going forward.
So Ramila, I mean, and as Freya said, there is a dedicated section in which we'll get to in a moment about some further recommendations. But Ramila, we touched on this briefly, but how are you thinking about, your advice about how businesses and government should respond? And there's a question from Carolyn, and she asks that, what would your advice be to a company who sources 90% of their garments from China? How might they have an effective exit strategy without necessarily undermining the business and perhaps hurting workers at the same time? So any thoughts on that, very difficult situation?
It is a very difficult situation. When it comes to China, it can't be just, the slave labor. The whole government, all external international community has to be part of a bigger picture. So where the sanctions are enforced, where the people are Magnitsky style acts are enforced, it's very difficult. I mean, for the industries, they need to divest. It can't be just, you can't rely on China to produce everything. If you go out shopping, as you said, 1 of 2 garments is made in China. Now, to put all your eggs in one basket, Australia has found itself in a very difficult position, not just in the garment, in wine, in crayfish, in seafood, and so forth. So we need to divest to other countries that we do businesses with, and countries that abide by laws and regulations, or that give you free access to these countries to check out their supply chains and who they're using. So unfortunately, to stop slave labor happening in East Turkestan or of the Uyghurs, it can't be just relying on companies to give you the information, because they don't have access. Governments need to step in, international community needs to step in, and it has to be a part and parcel of holding China overall to account, not just in slave labor, but cyber attack of international, the One Road, One Belt initiative, and so on and so forth. So to do this, companies need to divest, they need to look elsewhere.
So, Amy, I want to give you a chance to talk about recommendations as well, in terms of, what your call to business would be in terms of improving the quality of the report. And there's also a question from Lucy on the chat, which feeds on this. And she says, are there practical tips you might have for how to better engage with suppliers who may not, willingly accept contract provisions around that? But what would be your call, general calls to business that you're finding after this research?
Thanks. Generally, in terms of improvements in the quality of reporting, so as part of this research, we were looking at mandatory compliance with the law, but the other part of it, we were looking at that we were measuring and scoring companies on the quality of their disclosures. And in terms of improving on that, our recommendations would be that, in putting together your Modern Slavery Act statement, you should really be looking, it sounds very straightforward, but you should really be trying very hard to provide information against each of the reporting requirements in section 16. So 3/4 of companies weren't able to do that. So firstly, to provide information that actually steps through the section 16 criteria. And then secondly, to actually include full particulars and details on what you're doing, because there's very much a sense sometimes that companies are actually doing a lot more than is evident on the face of their statements. but aren't disclosing full information on this. And in terms of improvements in business responses to modern slavery more generally, we set out 4 broad areas in the report that are addressed to business and that are aimed at improving modern slavery responses. And these would be, firstly, to implement effective human rights due diligence to identify and address modern slavery risks, and that this human rights due diligence should be founded in genuine and in safe stakeholder engagement. So currently, a third of the companies that we looked at are doing this. Secondly, to build worker-centric approaches into corporate processes, and to embed these throughout what a company is doing. So from board level input and strategy, through to company policy, through to human rights due diligence, through to a company's grievance mechanisms, and across its remediation efforts. Worker-centric engagement should really be founded all the way across those. Thirdly, to embed responsible sourcing practices that support decent working conditions in supply chains and seek to avoid that downward pressure onto suppliers and ultimately onto workers themselves. So this pressure comes about through things like, you know, changing orders at the last minute, having particularly tight turnaround times, having very low prices. And the fourth key area that we have framed our recommendations around is to do with implementing effective remediation processes within companies, and to be introducing appropriate remedies for abuses for modern slavery harms when they come to light. And so in this respect, compensation should be full and it should be fair. Companies should be looking at establishing funds so that harms can be made good when they come to light, and that payment should be in full. So often we see companies talking about repaying the costs of recruitment fees, but you know, we would want to have compensation in full, so for harm or suffering, as well as things like unpaid wages. And then sort of separately, as a separate part of the remediation piece, companies should have systems for receiving complaints on modern slavery and plans to respond when things go wrong. So some kind of plan to govern their crisis response if modern slavery is found in the company's supply chains. And again, workers should be involved both in the design and the operation of these company remediation processes as well.
Thanks for those great points, and it coincides with one of the comments that Gary makes on the Q&A around the notion that you have to look at it rather holistically. So you can't just change reporting without thinking about responsible sourcing and purchasing practices and the fundamental way the business operates. And that builds into the points you were talking about around having a more worker-centric focus and also looking at the impact of the business's operations on others. And it also builds into this point when we think about modern slavery, not as some isolated incident, but as a continuum of exploitation, where sort of decent work conditions may gradually or suddenly tip over into what we would call, you know, forced labor, where there's this element of coercion in a workplace. But there's often there's a stage where the working conditions are very bad, and there's opportunities for businesses to intervene along that continuum. And Freya, I just wanted to come back to you on this sort of recommendation point, because I know in the report, there are some specific examples around this really tough question Carolyn raised earlier around China, and some advice that's in the report.
Yes, so we've set out some recommendations for companies sourcing garments from China on page 23 of our report, but it is a really complex issue and one that isn't easily answered. But having said that, there are steps that companies should be taking and should be looking to progress as they navigate how to resolve risks of being linked to Uyghur forced labor in China at the moment. So as a start, we've set an expectation that at a minimum, companies should be looking to map through all credible means their supply chain to evaluate whether there are any links to Uyghur forced labour, whether that's in Xinjiang, whether that's through labour transfer schemes, and to really try to the greatest extent to be able to satisfy themselves that Uyghur forced labour is not involved in their supply chain, although that is a very difficult task. There at least needs to be attempts to undertake that mapping exercise, and that where there are links, because general guidance is, of course, companies should be looking to resolve worker exploitation issues, and you don't exit immediately. You try to do your best to sort of resolve with suppliers non-compliances and human rights violations, if you like, to try and improve labour standards. But because of the situation in Xinjiang and the severity of the abuses that are reported, we would expect, if there are clear links to Xinjiang or other factories in China linked to the use of Uyghur forced labour, that companies would withdraw. And what we found in our review was only 1 in 10 companies had undertaken that mapping exercise, and only 4 companies had stated that they've either withdrawn from the region or are satisfied that they comprehensively have no links to the use of Uyghur forced labour. Beyond that, though, we've recommended collaborating with like-minded companies and organisations to put pressure to lift conditions and try to fight against this systematic oppression through the use of forced labour against the Uyghur people, as well as a general enforcement of prohibiting subcontracting, illicit subcontracting, because that is one of the key risks. And we actually found that garment companies were doing quite well on that. 70% did have controls. However, we didn't take that step of looking the extent to which those controls are enforced in practice.
So that's one sort of example where there's a potentially best practice example of at least setting up a system of perhaps contract clauses. But as we said, this was more of a paper review in some of it, so we haven't got to that next stage. The report highlights, the report highlights plenty of areas where companies are falling short, but Amy, there's also examples in some of the areas where there are best practice examples. Can you think of an example you'd share in any of the areas we've mentioned today that you thought was a useful example that others might want to think about?
It's hard to pick out particular, statements in isolation, but one of the things, part of the process that we went through was that the better practice examples were collected when we went through and reviewed the statements, and in each of the areas that we look at and that we cover in our report. So both in terms of the mandatory criteria and how companies are addressing those, but also in terms of risk and meaningful actions, we include in the report specific examples of the sort of stronger elements of company practice. So I'd encourage people to sort of dive into the report and look at those particular examples in there.
And we're almost out of time, so I'm going to give you sort of each a chance to sort of have a takeaway, either from what you thought was your overwhelming impression around this, or where you would like to see things to go. Because Amy, there's a government review coming up. So, what are the next steps of the group? And Freya, you might want to talk about some ideas around that review, and then last comments summing up. So Amy, I'll go to you first in terms of sort of what's next in terms of the review process.
Well, what's next in terms of the government review process is that there'll be a public review which will be initiated during the course of this year, and the terms of that are still being sort of worked through by the government, but it'll be an opportunity for all interested stakeholders, for businesses and for civil society groups to participate in discussions around key areas where there's a sense that the Act could be strengthened, and to sort of reflect and to come together and think about how the Act is tracking and how it has how it is working towards improving responses to modern slavery, or sort of potentially new approaches. In terms of what we'll be doing as a group next, there's plans afoot to be continuing with this work, so that the responses in the second round of reporting can be looked at. We're really keen to be able to sort of identify the extent to which improvement can be seen from companies, statements, and that the future steps that we've seen a lot of mentioned in statements, that the extent to which those future steps are being implemented over time. So there'll be another look at the second reporting round of statements, but then there's also going to be work going on, kind of looking behind the scenes, engaging with companies and other stakeholders to find out more about what's happening to address companies, modern slavery within companies.
And Freya, sort of finally, there's some number of questions around, what needs to happen in this review, what would need to change in the Act. And I know there's recommendations, and there's a question in the chat around what might be the difference between mandatory human rights due diligence and a duty to prevent. Is it the same thing or is it different? And how will that change things?
So I think that this review that's upcoming this year is a real opportunity to strengthen the Act and make it a lot more ambitious than what we've had for the last couple of years. I guess at the heart of it, what this Act comes down to is it's an Act that's meant to protect the people who put the clothes on our back, who stock the fruit on our shelves. And so coming back to that idea that this is an Act that should really work for people that are suffering these conditions at the bottom of the supply chain. And so at a minimum, we've recommended, a mandatory reporting regime that should be mandatory. There should be some hard consequences for companies that don't meet reporting requirements or that submit incomplete statements. But beyond that, we really want to see the Act reoriented to require action on behalf of companies rather than just a focus on reporting. And, we've termed this as a duty to prevent modern slavery, but it really goes hand in hand with that concept of undertaking appropriate, reasonable due diligence to really hone in on salient risks and to take concrete steps towards addressing those in a targeted and meaningful way, consistent with all the guidance that's out there on how companies should be governing their human rights and modern slavery related risks. And part of that, we would also like to see improved access to justice for affected workers, because at the moment the Act isn't accessible to workers who are impacted by these conditions. And so what we would like to see is where companies fail to undertake due diligence to mitigate modern slavery risks, there is a right of recourse too. So there's a suite of measures. This Act is not going to be able to solve every instance of exploitation or modern slavery or forced labour that's out there, but it's a really good start and opportunity for us to collectively, in a multi-stakeholder fashion, work towards addressing these issues and creating a piece of legislation that really lifts company attitudes and helps people who are in those situations of vulnerability.
So Ramila, let's finish with you, because I mean what Freya was saying is that what we have to do is connect to that this Act isn't just about reporting issues that are meaningless, that it's affecting people's lives, particularly on the ground, and these early indications are that it's not yet filtering down to have an impact on that. So what's your message that business needs to really engage and think about how they operate, and particularly their impact on your people, but more broadly as well, what would be your message?
The message would be, we have to act and act now, especially in my case as an Uyghur and as an activist. My people are dying. My culture is being eradicated, is being ethnically cleansed. And majority of the Uyghurs in East Turkestan are taken into these labor camps to produce all kinds of products for the international consumption. Now, as an activist, and with the elections coming up, our actions as an Uyghur activist would be to watch the amendment to the slave labor bill be approved by the government and pressure all parties across that this is a key priority area that they need to take up and held accountable if they should take office. Now, the other side of this is consumers. We are also out there educating consumers that they need to be aware what kind of products are they wearing. If they go and buy a shirt that's made in China, who is it made by? How is it sourced? Is the person who is picking the cotton to sewing the dress, is she or is he being properly paid? Are they being properly looked after? Do they have any rights? Or are they being politically indoctrinated that their culture and their well-being and their very being is being disappeared? So industries have to be very well educated in this field, and so do governments. And in the case of the Chinese Communist regime, it's part and parcel. So only the governments can't act alone. Industries have to come along with them and work together. So consumers have to be educated as to what they buy and how they buy. And when consumers make the decisions, what the market goes, then only will the industries start acting. If you say, no, I'm not going to buy a product that's made in China, I'm going to buy it from made somewhere else because the labor laws are better conditioned for the workers, then the industries will have to sit up and take note. And we're watching very closely what this review is going to come out at the end of the year, and we hope it's going to be positive and a very quick move, because it's taking way too long and we're losing way too many people.
And I think what we're saying, that the essence of this, what this report about, is trying to ensure that people's basic dignity is respected. So looking at moving beyond paper to action, which, you know, this report recognizes is very difficult for both government and business. But as you're very eloquently saying, is that the time is now, and that we can't continue to wait another 5 years to see if this type of reporting is working or it's having no effect, because the actions on the ground in many parts of the world of those people who are living in slavery are dire. So I want to thank you all, particularly Freya, Amy and Ramila today, for your wonderful thoughts in relation to this. Thank you all for joining us. And we will be able to send you a link to this recording later in the week, and you'll find it on the webpage of the Australian Human Rights Institute, and the report there also on the page of the Human Rights Law Centre. So thank you again for joining us, and have a great day.